Thank you very much, Professor Dennis. It's a pleasure to be here. I always enjoy coming to these ethics talks, and it's an honor now to deliver one myself. I'm going to talk to you about engineering the genomes of our children. I'm going to focus on policy-making questions associated with it. I'm anticipating the possibility that we will soon be able to genetically engineer our future children, and that the questions about how we should respond to this as a matter of public policy will be very challenging. Should policymakers ban the development and use of this technology altogether, or perhaps permit certain kinds of genetic engineering, but not others? Or should policymakers not only permit, but promote this new technology by providing public funding for genetic engineering research, just as they do for cancer and AIDS research, or by providing public subsidies to parents who could not otherwise afford genetic engineering, just as we now subsidize children's health care and early childhood education for poor families. We could also require private and public health insurers to provide coverage for certain kinds of genetic engineering, as we now require them to provide coverage for certain healthcare services considered basic or necessary. We might even decide that certain kinds of genetic engineering are so valuable in promoting the public welfare that we ought to subsidize genetic engineering for all, just as we subsidize the military to defend us all and public schools to educate us all. Before considering how we might answer these policy questions, and why I think it will be very difficult to do so, I'm going to offer a few examples of the kinds of genetic engineering that might someday be possible, so we can have these examples in mind as we ponder these policy challenges. So, what sorts of genetic engineering technologies might become possible? First, we might be able to engage in what is often called therapeutic engineering. As research on the human genome continues, we are discovering that certain genes influence the likelihood that we will develop breast or ovarian cancer, lung cancer, Huntington's disease, Alzheimer's disease, and more. We might one day be able to revise the genomes of early-stage human embryos created in IVF procedures to eliminate these predispositions to disease. If science and technology enable us to engage in therapeutic engineering, is there any reason why policymakers should not only permit but promote efforts to engineer future healthy children, just as they promote preventative public health measures such as inoculations and advances in individual health care aimed at curing diseases? For a second example, let's consider engineering that is not aimed at preventing disease, but instead at improving or augmenting certain human traits, what is often referred to as enhancement engineering. Not all, but some parents might choose to enhance certain traits in their future children if it were possible to do so safely and effectively. Let's consider as possibilities for future human enhancement some of the traits we can already genetically engineer in non-human animals. For one, scientists can engineer mice to be smarter. A team of researchers at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center reported in May 2007 that they had engineered mice to eliminate a certain enzyme in their brains, an enzyme that's of interest to researchers because it appears to be involved in Alzheimer's disease in human beings. In this study in mice, eliminating this enzyme in their brains had a dramatic effect. Quoting from a report of the results by Dr. James Bibb, the engineered mice were more adept at learning to navigate a water maze and remembering that being in a certain box involves a mild shock. Equally important, when a situation changed, such as the water maze being rearranged, the engineered mice were much faster to realize that things were different and work out the new route. Assuming no other harmful effects, should parents be able to choose to enhance the intelligence of their children if we one day learn how to engineer smart kids? Or should policymakers regulate genetic engineering to permit this only if, for example, a child otherwise would likely have below average intelligence? So this might then be considered a form of therapeutic engineering. Or perhaps this is just the sort of enhancement that policymakers should promote. by a nationwide genetic engineering initiative that ensures that every family has access to intelligence engineering, and by a publicity campaign to encourage parents to engineer the minds of the next generation to ensure their greater welfare and a more competitive America as well. So what other kinds of traits can scientists now genetically engineer in mice? They can engineer them to be less anxious and more willing to engage in novelty-seeking behavior. Perhaps parents who are themselves uncomfortable in new or risky situations would want to engineer their children to be more comfortable in these situations, viewing this of potential benefit in their children's social and professional lives. Would this be so different from what generations of parents have attempted to do for their children, learn from their own shortcomings and mistakes, and pass along the benefits of their learning to their children, for better or worse? In previous generations, parents have attempted to do this by providing their children with better education, or better health care, or by striving to cultivate better habits. In future generations, parents might strive to convey benefits by genetic engineering, aimed at remedying genetically influenced shortcomings of temperament. Should policymakers honor future parents' choices regarding genetic engineering as they have past generations' choices regarding providing better education and health care and cultivating the virtues? Scientists also routinely engineer animals to have particular coat colors. Perhaps parents might want to engineer their children to have what they believe to be a beautiful or distinctive skin pigmentation. We might even imagine a future in which there are fashion trends in kids' skin hues, as there are now in kids' clothing and hairstyles. Scientists also have engineered fish and rabbits to glow a fluorescent green. Might this appeal to certain parents looking to be trendsetters? Here again, policymakers generally have not intervened in matters of aesthetics or taste applied by parents in choosing their children's wardrobe or hairstyles, but they have prohibited what is considered physical or mental abuse and intervened to prevent it. Would genetic engineering for a particular skin hue, falling somewhere within the range of human skin complexions, constitute child abuse? Would engineering for green fluorescence? And consider one more possibility for human genetic engineering: longevity engineering to increase the human lifespan. A great deal of research on aging is underway. In one study whose findings were reported just last month, researchers examined a group of individuals aged 95 to 110 and their children, and found that mutations in certain genes involved with the action of insulin-like growth factor appeared to influence both their height and their longevity, making people both shorter than average and much longer lived. The senior author on this study at Albert Einstein College of Medicine said the findings suggest that these gene mutations somehow play a role in extending the human lifespan, as they do in many other organisms. We can certainly imagine that parents might show considerable interest in the possibility of engineering their future children for increased longevity, just as they have shown considerable interest in providing health care and other support for their children to help ensure that they live as long as possible. The prospect of longevity engineering suggests that the boundary I suggested between therapeutic engineering and enhancement engineering is blurry at best, and thus likely not very helpful in guiding us to good policy choices if we're tempted to try to use it for that purpose. Would longevity engineering be an enhancement if it involves eliminating the limits on lifespan that seem to be built into our genes and thus disfavored by policymakers? Or is aging simply the ultimate disease to be cured or conquered, as we have cured or compensated for other genetically determined conditions, such as presbyopia, by surgery or eyeglasses, and hence deserving of policy support and encouragement? In any event, policymakers generally have supported public health measures, from inoculations to public sanitation and individual health care services aimed at extending the human lifespan. Should they respond any differently to genetic engineering as a technique for extending the lifespan even further. So, now that we've considered just a few of the many possibilities for human genetic engineering, I'm going to tell you next why I think the policy questions raised about whether we should permit, promote, prohibit, or regulate some or all of these and other kinds of genetic engineering will be particularly challenging, and how I think we might best cope with them. Here's an outline for your benefit. Genetic engineering poses what I call a fractious problem for policymaker. I list in the top half of this slide 5 characteristics of fractious problems that make them especially difficult to understand and address. In the bottom half of the slide, I refer to how we might best cope with fractious problems by a navigational approach to policymaking that includes the 5 listed features. Focusing now on the top half of the slide on fractious problems, I'll tell you how I first arrived at the concept of a fractious problem with these 5 characteristics. As I studied the gathering policy debate surrounding genetic engineering and the deep disagreement about what our policies should be and about what was important to deciding what our policies should be, I was struck by how familiar the debate seemed. We have encountered fractious problems before, and I believe we are likely to encounter them again and with increasing frequency. These are problems that are increasingly thrown off by advances in science and technology, and that, looking at the first, pose novel ethical and policy challenges, challenges that we have not encountered before, so we have no prior understanding of their particular features and no prior experience with ways to cope with them. Second, these problems are complex in their scientific and technical dimensions, their implications for the human biological, psychological, and social being, and their implications for society. Third, these problems are ethically fraught in that they tap deep secular and religious foundational beliefs about matters of a significance across worldviews, for example, about the beginning and end of life, about the practices of procreation and parenting, about what it means to be human. Fourth, in modern, pluralistic, democratic, political communities like ours, these problems are divisive. The foundational beliefs tapped will be diverse and in some cases conflicting in their implications for both individual and policy choice for the community. And fifth, the problems posed also are of unavoidable public concern. We are unable to avert our eyes and view these matters as purely private and none of our business, given their subject matter involving life and death, the well-being of future members of the political community, and the future of humankind. Examples of fractious problems we have encountered before include the ongoing debate surrounding federal funding of human embryonic stem cell research, and before that, the controversy surrounding the withdrawal of Terry Schiavo's feeding tube. Fractious problems on the near horizon include those surrounding neurotechnologies that take pictures of the brain that might help us see the thoughts and predict future actions of criminal suspects or perhaps job applicants. Genetic technologies developed over the past several years now can determine identity very reliably, and some have proposed creating a national database that includes identifying genetic information on every person in the U.S., and that might be used both for criminal investigation and other purposes. Genetic tests that can both diagnose and predict the likelihood of developing genetically influenced diseases are being developed at a very rapid rate and can be used not only to determine medical treatment plans, but potentially whether we can obtain insurance or employment. What is noteworthy about debates surrounding fractious problems, such as embryonic stem cell research and end-of-life technologies, is how unfruitful and acrimonious they tend to be. how difficult it is to arrive either at policy resolutions or even at a shared framework for debating what these policy resolutions should be. One side in the embryonic stem cell debate implores us to consider the destruction of human life involved in embryonic stem cell research and frames the issues by reference to past instances of abuse of the innocent and defenseless, of humans excluded from the circle drawn around those on the inside who count. Another side implores us to consider the fate of those who are currently self-aware, suffering, and dying prematurely for the lack of cures that we have it within our power to pursue. The policy debate surrounding Terri Schiavo was similarly polarized. These debates surrounding fractious problems are different in kind from other, more fruitful sorts of policy debates in which our arguments engage one another and we can expect progress along a familiar path. We have successfully debated and resolved questions, for example, about whether car manufacturers should be required to equip their cars with seat belts and whether motorists should be required to use them, about where to build new bridges or highways, about how to regulate interest rates and financial institutions. In the productive debates surrounding policy problems like these, debaters typically address a limited set of contested issues, gradually refine the points in dispute, recognize new data as relevant to the resolution of these points, note their disagreement about the relative weight to be given to values or principles such as liberty and welfare, and eventually resolve some, even if not all, of the issues, thus placing a policy resolution within reach. But the debates surrounding fractious problems tend to get stuck early on and settle into familiar ruts of repetitious disagreement. These debates are unfortunate in that they foster a sense that we simply cannot understand one another, or worse, that we do not want to. These debates are also unfortunate in disabling one of the most powerful means we have for solving community problems, drawing on the efforts of many minds to help understand and cope with them. If I'm right that fractious problems share these 5 characteristics that make them especially challenging, with these unfortunate results for our political communities, and if I also am right that the advent of genetic engineering poses a fractious problem, how might we hope to better understand and cope with fractious problems, including genetic engineering? I now turn to the navigational approach whose features are listed in the bottom half of the slide. The slide lists 5 features of a navigational approach to policymaking. I've listed them in order according to their responsiveness to particular characteristics of fractious problems. So on a navigational approach, the first feature, the use of past precedent and future imagining, is particularly helpful in addressing the first characteristic of fractious problems, their novelty, and so on. But these features of a navigational approach listed here can be helpful in addressing other characteristics of fractious problems as well. And my discussion of these features will range across a number of these characteristics of fractious problems. Regarding the novelty of fractious problems, although we cannot look to past experience that is directly on point to help us understand and cope with the issues they pose, still we can find some help from past precedent. So, for example, although we don't have past experience with genetic engineering, we do have experience with historical efforts at eugenics. We have drawn the public policy conclusion based on that historical experience that governmentally enforced eugenic measures, such as involuntary sterilization, offend our shared commitment to human liberty, for example. As a result, involuntary sterilization statutes that were widely enacted and applied until the mid-20th century have been repealed or limited in their scope or application. We have also concluded from historical experience that eugenic public health programs, such as efforts in the 1970s to encourage women who learned they were carrying children with conditions such as Down syndrome to have abortions, offend our shared commitment to human equality regardless of disability. And we have also learned from past and present experience that we often are mistaken in our scientific beliefs about causal connections between this gene and that feature, or between this feature and human happiness or well-being. The 20th century assumptions about the genetic causes of mental conditions that were relied on in involuntary sterilization statutes enacted in that century, we now know were mistaken. And we increasingly have learned that assumptions about the connection between being able-bodied, for example, and being happy, are not supported by scientific evidence either. So in coping with novel problems, we also can draw on our capacity to imagine the future, as in books and films, from Aldous Huxley's Brave New World to the film Gattaca. In this way, we can explore, in a concrete, contextualized way, the consequences of one policy choice or another, and test these consequences against our knowledge of the world and against our shared principles. An example of coping with novelty by drawing on past precedent and future imaginings to take the measure of novel policy problems and arrive at resolutions guided by shared principles appears in the judicial, practical art of common law decision-making, in which each opinion of the court is grounded in the relevant similarities to past precedent, and by imagining the consequences of future applications of the ruling in that case. A navigational approach to policymaking is in part an effort to draw on the virtues of the judicial approach to policymaking in our legislative efforts to respond to the challenges posed by fractious problems. A navigational approach to policymaking also recognizes that fractious problems are daunting in their complexity. We cannot hope to make good policy decisions without the deep reductionist understanding of the complex biological facts and processes involved in genetic engineering. But we also cannot hope to make good policy decisions unless we can integrate a holist understanding of the meaning of procreation and parenting in our lives as individuals and members of families, and the significance of shared principles such as our commitments to liberty and equality in our lives as members of political communities. Accomplishing this integration will require, among other things, the contributions of experts spanning the natural and social sciences and the humanities. Our social capacity to accomplish this integration has been demonstrated in some cases, as when groups of experts and members of the public have worked across disciplinary boundaries and diverse religious and secular commitments to consider the implications of life support technologies for medical and legal definitions of death, and together arrived at an integrated conception of death as brain death. This definition likely will undergo revision and refinement over time and with experience, but it has provided a good enough resolution to pressing problems raised by the advent of life support technologies that could continue to support respiration and the circulation of blood even after brain death. The ethically fraught nature of fractious problems and their divisiveness also pose significant challenges to policymaking. It is challenging enough to arrive at, say, transportation or economic policies in which the issues are far less fraught in their implications for our deepest commitments. Here, contextualized approaches to ethical and policy decision-making suggest that we may be able to diffuse the divisiveness and navigate to acceptable incremental resolutions if we focus on studying the issues first at the level of shared experience and second by reference to shared principles. Casuistry or case-based reasoning, as commonly used in medical ethics, is one example of a contextualized approach to ethics. Also, ethicists working in the tradition of virtue ethics tend to emphasize the importance of bringing practical wisdom to the consideration of contextualized problems. And common law decision-making is a contextualized approach to policymaking in the following sense. Before considering the complaint of a party, common law courts require evidence of a genuine case in controversy, an actual concrete dispute between parties. The issues are then examined through advocacy of competing perspectives on these controversies in search of a resolution that is sufficient unto the day, employing decision principles that are no broader than necessary to resolve the concrete dispute at hand. These resolutions are then subject to revision over time as they are tested by future disputes arising from later experience. Implicit in these contextualized approaches is the belief that humans are well suited to solving problems as they arise in the concrete context of our lives as individuals and members of communities. If we were not, we would not have survived to this point, even or perhaps especially when we must understand and cope with ethically fraught and divisive issues. We work best from the bottom up, immersing ourselves in the contextualized problems as seen from multiple perspectives, rather than debating first at the level of principles. A navigational approach also assumes that we do share certain principles in our modern pluralistic democracies, commitments to liberty, equality, and the common welfare among them. So, although we navigate from the concrete problem to incremental resolutions and then revise these resolutions over time in response to experience, we do not navigate in unbounded seas. While diverse, pluralistic, democratic communities are particularly likely to give rise to fractious problems, they also are capable of understanding and coping with them, thanks in part to these shared commitments that are memorialized in our founding documents and in subsequent laws that aim to make the promise of these principles real. A navigational approach also assumes that diverse, pluralistic, democratic communities are capable of arriving at good resolutions for now and better resolutions over time, in part because of our multiple perspectives. Our arguments born of diverse and conflicting beliefs are helpful in penetrating the complexity of fractious problems, opening our eyes to dimensions of the problems we otherwise might not have seen. Finally, on a navigational approach, we recognize that the unavoidably public nature of fractious problems imposes certain constraints on the resolutions we arrive at. We know that even though procreation and parenting are intimately personal and private activities, they also have a public dimension that requires policy attention, even if the ultimate policy resolution in particular cases is to honor the free choices of parents. Genetic engineering concerns children who are both the offspring of their parents, and we assume best loved and cared for by them, but also future members of our political community, entitled to the protection of our shared principles just as all others. We cannot say that anything goes when it comes to parental choices to engineer their children, just as we cannot say anything goes when it comes to the well-being of any other members of the political community who are subject to the imposition of choices by others. We recognize this by our laws prohibiting child abuse and providing public resources for the care of children whose parents are unable or unwilling to provide them with what they need to survive and flourish. On a navigational approach to genetic engineering, our debates surrounding genetic engineering will recognize that our public life includes both these pluralistic components involving a wide range of free choice by diverse individuals, but it also includes these communitarian components, and our policy choices will need to navigate this boundary. So, before returning now to the 5 examples of genetic engineering I mentioned at the outset, and the policy choices we might face regarding them. Is the navigational approach I sketch here very different from the approach we now take to fractious problems? I think it is in a number of ways. It would ask debaters to refrain from proposing competing, comprehensive solutions guided by principles, be they founded in liberty or in the natural or in maximization of welfare, and invite them instead to examine and find incremental solutions to an ongoing series of discrete policy problems. The approach would welcome experts and members of the public to join the debate on a level that all are competent to understand and address from their diverse perspectives, the level of concrete, contextualized problems. And it would recognize that these problems are novel and complex, so we need to draw on our shared history and imagined future and on our multiple perspectives, and also acknowledge the guidance of shared principles. A navigational approach also reduces the stakes to make cooperative endeavor to solve problems easier, since we seek only modest and incremental solutions to limited problems as they arise. And we recognize that these solutions are always subject to revision with experience. A navigational approach also frankly acknowledges the tension between our plural desires to exercise free choice and our shared communitarian principles, and strives to strike a balance between these. Now, returning to the policy questions posed at the outset, where would a navigational approach begin, at least, in understanding and addressing the policy questions about banning, regulating, promoting genetic engineering, in the example I started with first of therapeutic engineering to eliminate predisposition to disease? And here I just sketch some thoughts as beginning points. A navigational approach will not appeal to the divide between therapeutic and enhancement engineering, or to natural versus unnatural human functioning, except perhaps as they emerge from discussions of the concrete contextualized issues posed by particular kinds of genetic engineering as instructive about whether these kinds of engineering are likely to contribute to human welfare based on our experience. There would be consideration of risks and benefits of the intervention as opposed to other conventional therapies, as in considering any medical intervention, but also additional considerations due to the complexity of the evolved biological being. We know that some genes that predispose us to one disease also protect us from others. So we might hesitate in the face of limited knowledge about the implications of pursuing a genetic engineering remedy rather than a conventional medical remedy. We might also need to ponder how the choice to pursue genetic engineering might affect the research effort directed to conventional remedies. And this might vary across diseases, especially if genetic engineering were not available to all due to expense or religious or ethical objection to the practice. So considerations of the social context might lead to choices to limit or at least not promote certain kinds of genetic engineering, even if safe and effective, in preference instead for conventional therapies that can benefit more. To the second example, how about engineering for intelligence, for smart kids? Here we might look to our historical efforts to apply soft technologies, from education to parental care, to develop the intelligence of children, regardless of whether they are above or below average in intelligence. This suggests the centrality to parents and communities of the cultivation of human intelligence, whatever the starting baseline. But we might also consider a future in which only some have access to this engineering and their children enjoy the benefit of significant increases in this highly valued trait. This might argue for universal subsidies for intelligence engineering. But by placing this much emphasis on intelligence, would we be committing future generations to an experience of life that sacrifices the development and cultivation of other talents and ways of engaging the world that are important to human welfare? if we are considering a widespread public engineering program to increase intelligence, are we confident that making everyone smarter will improve the welfare of individuals and communities? This might argue for a policy resolution, for example, that permits but does not promote research or development of this kind of genetic engineering. After all, there are many forms of biological intelligence enhancement, from caffeine to Ritalin, that are widely available to those who choose to use them for themselves or for their children. The only concern might be the permanency of the effects imposed on future children in light of questionable evidence of a benefit to them. Whether this might be compared to child abuse, though, given the wide range of parental discretion permitted in other realms of parenting, is a matter for debate at best. Third, as to engineering our future children to be less anxious, more willing to engage in novelty-seeking behavior. Should policymakers honor future parents' choices regarding genetic engineering as they have past generations' choices regarding education, healthcare, and cultivation of the virtues? Or would choosing to revise the temperament of children be more akin to efforts to exert mind control by overreaching individuals or government policies so as to diminish the freedom and choices of future children, rather than compared to educational efforts that expand their capacities or even intelligence engineering for the same purpose? Perhaps we would conclude in this case that parents should not be able permanently to revise the temperaments of their children by genetic engineering, although efforts to modify their temperaments to the extent education and cultivation of the virtues can accomplish this, of course, would be acceptable. Fourth, regarding engineering for skin hue. Would the holistic experience of persons of different kinds of skin colors be relevant to the policy choice so that, for example, engineering might be banned for as long as skin hue matters in our social context, because any choice reemphasizes that it matters? Then, over time, if skin hue and other aspects of our personal appearance are gradually drained of their social significance and diminished to the status of fashion choices, perhaps these choices might be permitted as neutral in their effects on individuals and society with respect to principles of welfare and equality that might be applied. As for engineering for green fluorescence, though, like any other extreme examples of parenting behavior that have the consequence of marking children for potential ridicule or revulsion, perhaps this should be banned. Fifth, finally, with respect to longevity engineering, policymakers generally have supported public health measures, from inoculations to public sanitation, as well as advances in individual health care services that are intended to expand the human lifespan. Should they respond any differently to genetic engineering as a technique for extending the human lifespan beyond any current genetically encoded limits? Here we might ponder all the social institutions built around assumptions about our common lifespan that would be potentially disrupted by longevity engineering for the few or for everyone. Love and work foremost among them. If we lived 200 or 1,000 years, would institutions such as marriage and the family undergo their most radical reshaping yet? Would the notion of work and tenure and retirement have to be reworked? Probably. But we have done this incrementally in response to expanded lifespans generated by public health measures and individual health care over the generations. Generally, we do not intervene with the most fundamental of our pluralistic choices to continue living ourselves and to do the best we can to ensure that our children enjoy the longest possible lives. But these implications for individuals and society might give pause to thoughts at least of funding longevity research or subsidizing longevity engineering. I welcome your thoughts and questions now about fractious problems and a navigational approach to policy making, and I thank you for your attention. Thank you. questions, I'd be happy to. Okay.
It's kind of a question about what is driving or drove initially your coming up with a navigational approach. Thinking especially of your first example about sort of therapy enhancement and stuff, because you talked in ways that suggested on the one hand that there were ways that the navigational approach might stop the kind of just clash of large-level principles that just stop discussion from even getting started, really.
Yeah.
So you might think the navigational policy approach is attractive and was initially attractive to you because it stops that sort of log jam at the very beginning of a discussion and allows discussion to begin. But then when you talked about how for different kinds of possible genetic problems, one might actually, in a sense, get a more fine-tuned answer by using this sort of bottom-up approach rather than top-down. That makes me think, well, okay, so the navigational approach, you might actually get better answers instead of just the first way I was thinking about it was allows the conversation to actually reach some answers. And clearly you can say both are things that attracted me. But I was curious about whether you could say a little bit about how you came up with this approach and what aspects of it seem most salient to you.
Yeah, your observations are correct that I do value both, and both of those motivate this effort to get around what looks like a vehicle stuck in the rut spinning its wheels, and all the negative consequences that I referred to, which I think are so unfortunate. And I think initially I was just puzzled with trying to understand the phenomenon. Why are the wheels spinning? How can we arrive at sort of classifications of the nature of these arguments? Why are they not meeting one another? Why are folks talking past each other? And this is something I explore at some length in my book. And of course that's sort of academic or scholarly inquiry, then also gives way, given the sort of focus that many of us in policy and ethics and philosophy in town associated with bioethics and biopolicy have, which is how can we make something positive grow out of our observations about the way things are and our thoughts about the way things could be. And so that led to me thinking, well, now that I've looked at this phenomenon, the vehicle spinning its wheels, and I think I've gotten a little bit of a handle on, what's going on here, and I begin to see these characteristics repeated in these debates, can I think of things that we could do to get the vehicle on track, to have it, it's true, it would be putting along in a sort of, it wouldn't be speeding down the freeway as some folks hope for with the flag, waving high saying maximization of welfare, hooray, It wouldn't be doing that. It would be puttering along from one problem to the other, but actually getting things done and getting them done well, I think. So it moved from observation of why we're stuck to, well, how can we address that, to thinking about, and this is perhaps what your question probes for, ultimately, what are good solutions? If I'm a committed utilitarian, I think I ought to be headed down that freeway, waving the maximization of welfare flag, and hoping I can persuade others and move the discussion along that route. I've thought about that. I thought about other kinds of principles and so forth. And as I sorted through them, I gradually came to believe that this sort of policy making that arrives at good solutions is one we can have confidence at a minimum addresses the negative consequences to our political community. And secondly, again as a minimum, moves the policy debate forward. But thirdly, arrives at probably the best solutions that human community practical reasoners can arrive at. And here's where pragmatists and other sorts of people will sort of struggle with what I struggle with, arrive at something like good or true or right answers over time, or better answers, I should say, based on better understanding, better resolutions, guided by principles that I think we've arrived at when I speak of them. And, this, of course, is a brief talk, so I speak of liberty, equality, welfare in a very general way. But I think those principles reflect accumulated human ethical and policy knowledge that, again, approaches on something like truth, the right, or good. And that we, over time, as collective reasoners, can see these things, and if we're lucky, capture them in documents like constitutions and try to make them more real or realize them in the world by laws and policies pursuant to them. And I think that we can, by an approach like this, in a way on the ground at an even lower level than enactment of laws aimed at achieving equality, at a lower level, faced with these sort of concrete problems posed by science and technology, we can make real certain principles that will carry us to the best resolutions that we then improve in an iterative way over time. To the extent human beings can reason and act and achieve good, ethically good solutions, I think the only way I know of that they can do that is by their collective efforts in a fashion like this, the more I think about it. So, yes, Michael, and then I'll take that. Yes?
With regard to your last words, I'm admiring your optimism in
Yeah.
a certain way. And, of course, there are shared principles, equality and liberty. But looking at any ethical debate, even if we have shared principles, we have lots of disagreements.
Yes.
So it seems to be impossible to derive certain decisions from what we would accept as shared principles.
Yeah.
Look at the abortion debate.
Yes.
Say we are sharing all principles, or maybe not all.
Yeah.
But we are having disagreements about
Yeah.
the hierarchy, ranking, about anything, So, the main idea with regard to these ethical issues, saying, okay, if there's a disagreement, then we should try to resolve those disagreements by means of contextualization. I'm not sure whether that will really work.
I'm not sure either, but I think so. And I sort of take the picture you describe of principles and deriving solutions top down. I think we agree that we don't think that will work. And I redraw the picture. We're on a big river, stuck together on a flatboat, kind of creaky, and kind of close quarters here, and not everybody's a lot of fun, shall we say. And we're navigating down the river together. But the good news is we're at least moving, whether we're moving forward or to good or whatever solution, but we're moving forward, and as I say, the waters are not unbounded. There are principles that at least operate on this side and that side. And even though we disagree based on differing, deeply held beliefs about the status of the embryo, the early stage embryo, the fetus, and so forth, as a person, or the moral worth, and so on, we nonetheless agree on so much else. The status of the born infant, or that even if embryos aren't humans, they're not nothing. And that, the woman's life is precious and her choices and so forth are precious, and so on. And about how raising a child is an incredibly important activity not to be undertaken lightly, and who raises a child is of deep importance. So much that we agree on. And so many, the river is so vast and wide, so many choices to be made and problems to be resolved. And, the current model I see is that car spinning its wheels in the rut. I want to get on the river and give it a go, because I think there's so many ways we can navigate to good solutions to a whole bunch of problems, even while we continue to disagree about some others. And the other model, we just keep spinning our wheels and never get to all the ones we can resolve. We just keep sort of ruminating and sort of, spinning our wheels around that open sore of the ones we can't agree on. So, yes.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Trisha Mans. I'm a sophomore here at Agnes.
Tricia?
And I want to know, do you talk about maybe the idea of eliminating cultures or races talked about peaking self-pigmentation. What if we move by genetically engineering our children? Would like the faces all be the same?
Yeah, I wrestle with this in my book. Imagine a couple of parents. My book has 3 scenarios set 100 years in the future where you have parents come to genetic engineering counselors in reproductive counseling offices in 100 years in the future when genetic engineering is possible. One of these couples, they have medium brown complexions, and they're both committed to engineering their child to have an ebony complexion because they think that would be exquisitely beautiful. And they, along with other features that they want, they explore this, they talk with their counselor about this and ponder whether they ought to do that and whether it would be good for their child and whether she would be special because she would stand out in this way. They think she will be much more beautiful than they are. They view themselves as kind of plain Jane folks, not gorgeous, but they want to make her taller and, this ebony complexion and other features and so on. So in thinking about that and thinking about this talk, I was struck by our conversations about these markers of race and how we go back and forth in our conversations about whether they're unimportant or profoundly important and why. And, how important they are to the identity of groups of us. I think in some of the books that have been written on this topic, there's this fear that people would say, in a predominantly white culture, or predominantly black culture, predominantly Asian culture, parents who care about the social success of their child would engineer their child to look like the majority or dominant culture. And this raises the very question I think you're posing, which is, isn't there a risk of sort of social pressure to make your child fit in, look alike, sort of the opposite of fluorescing green, to look just like everybody else? And wouldn't that be an awful pity if by human choice, not as a result of, the choices we happen to make about mates and what we call interracial or, marriage or something, but by choice, we were to eliminate distinctive features of the human phenotypes that have been associated with race, and to do so for the reason that these groups of people are disadvantaged in this society. And I think there is something really awful about that, a terrible loss that I think is associated with it. But note how complex my chain of reasoning was. If there's a future world in which, it's the content of one's character, and these other things we don't see, and I don't know exactly what such a future world would be like, or what its dimensions would be, or whether these sort of markers of race, ethnicity, and so forth would still be significant in that they form part of our identity. We identify in families and religious groups and ethnic and cultural groups and so on, whether they would still, I should think they would still be important in that way. But what I imagined here, and you picked up on, is a sort of peculiar twist about that. Initially we might say we should ban any sort of intervention to sort of prefer whatever racial features over another, including skin hue or whatever. But eventually, in that future world in which these things have lost their significance because we've achieved something like a closer realization of those principles and, that are memorialized in our founding documents, that maybe then it would seem like a less significant choice, maybe a choice that parents might make, maybe one we wouldn't approve of, just as maybe we'd sort of turn up our noses or look down our noses at parents who choose to dress their children as sort of fashion accessories, while choosing to engineer your child sort of as a fashion statement, selecting their skin hue or something, we might view as distasteful, but maybe we wouldn't ban it as we would now, when it would be so culturally, socially fraught. Well, that was a long answer. I hope it was responsive in part to what you asked. We have a question here and then there. Yes, sir. Oh, and then there. Okay.
Well, it seems like it's going to be very easy from the genetic standpoint to eliminate diseases by screening. We do a lot of that right now. But one of the things that you have to have in a society is certainly a certain intelligence about science, and science education is certainly going down in the country. If you look at the educational level of science in the Congress and Senate is minimal. And so these are the people you're trusting with passing on. But if you look at the general population, you've also got this sense that they think science can do certain things, and you're going to run into all kinds of problems. And I think the trait that people more likely would have engineered would be the height, intelligence, etc., the beauty traits, and that's the thing you'd like to see in their children.
Yeah.
And I think the general population is going to think it's just as easy going out picking out the color of your car in the future. Don't you see a lot of litigation coming out of there? Because I think that you're looking at where we see failed Botox injections, failed breast augmentation procedures and things like that. Don't you see that it's really a dangerous road for a lot of geneticists or in the medical community to get into?
Yeah, and that sort of gets into a bundle of questions of whether we could actually envision moving from current circumstances in which we have these genetic screening tests that can be used in an IVF procedure, so you can, in a way, design your child by discarding certain embryos after testing them. Now with a new technique, PGH, for about 6,000 genetically influenced conditions. So you can get really picky. And that raises a whole different set of ethical and policy issues. Set that aside. But would we ever move from that to genetic engineering? There might be impediments. Predominant among them would be, as you say, the liability concerns. If you say this baby is not to order, I want either to, you can't return it very well, but I want compensation. You have liability issues. And there's also the question of getting past the experimental stage to actual, doing it as a practice. Now, with IVF, what happened is people just did it. And what may well happen with human cloning and genetic engineering is people just do it. They don't go knocking on the FDA's door and doing that sort of thing. They just do it. And then they sort of say, I dare you to regulate it. And the I dare you from IVF has gone unanswered for decades. We regulate the personnel who staff these places, but we don't regulate it in other ways. We collect data about success rates and so forth. So that might happen. So we could see getting over that experimental hurdle. But then, as you say, what about the sort of liability hurdle? Now, part of my life has been as a lawyer. And as a lawyer, I could imagine efforts to draw up contracts that say, hey, there's no warranty here. There's no, you just take the baby as is, no implied or express warranty and that sort of stuff. But that, even talking about that, suggests something that your question raises as problematic. Are we really going to order up our babies like we order up our Hondas with this accessory and that, and the 3-option model and this and that? And as soon as you'd begin to do that and begin to have these contracts, I don't know. I mean, we have agreements governing marriage and the distribution of assets, agreements we enter into before marriage, and we don't think that corrupts, or maybe we do, the relationship for those folks who enter into them. But I don't know the answer to that, whether you have folks willing to do it. I suspect you'll always have folks willing to do it, just, either to make the money or make the splash or whatever. But then what the liability issues, what the fallout will be, I'm sure they'll hire the best lawyers they can get to try to ensure that there isn't liability. But what courts will ultimately decide, that's another question again. Well, let's see. I had a question over here, and then a question back here, and then a question here. Yes?
You talk a lot about how these practice problems are going to be affecting the public as well as the and I'm thinking about the Genome bill, and I'm thinking about that and how...
About, I'm sorry, I missed that. About what?
The Genome bill, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act.
Okay. I assume that this bill is like many other bills and like bills that have been passed in various state legislatures that in some way protect against disclosure of genetic information to insurers or employers and sometimes other entities. And we have already in place by executive order some protection at the federal level in some respects and so on. It's peculiar when, I mean, it's an interesting question to raise because the Human Genome Project and all of the research projects in its wake, in part, has revealed information that you might then honor as saying knowledge, to the extent we can hook up this information or data with, what it means in terms of the human phenotype or our predisposition to disease and so on. So it takes on increasing significance as we begin to understand it. And as it does, two things are sort of happening at once. First, there's a prospect that we might do what, all the people who asked for funding for the Human Genome Project said we were going to do, which is actually find cures for diseases because we understand the etiology, what causes diseases, and we learn how to tailor medicines and so on. So there's the hope that as we get this information that sort of ripens into knowledge, we'll be able to do that far more effectively. I mean, in a perfect world, I suspect if you put these folks down in a room and said to employers, insurance companies, and potential and individuals, what would you like to have happen? Would you like it if we could go poof and this information would disappear and not be available to anyone on any side? I think they'd all say, yes, that would be delightful. We could go back to the way it was. But we can't do that. And hence comes the very difficult questions about what's fair in regulating this information. Is it fair that a person goes and gets the, Huntington's test, finds out they're going to be disabled in 3 years, dead in 10. They run to an insurance company, don't reveal this information, really pile on the insurance, pay premiums, over the next 10 years that are, 1/100th of the payout. And if you had a whole bunch of folks who get this new genetic information running to insurance companies and doing this, insurance companies would go belly up and they couldn't pay their current insureds. On the other hand, can we really tell people who get this awful information during this period, this therapeutic gap, this interim time, that not only did you get the bad news that you've got the Huntington's disease gene, here's another whammy for you. You didn't pile up enough health and life insurance beforehand. You can't now. Nobody's going to insure you. So your family's going to have trouble paying your funeral expenses, and we don't know if your child's going to go to college and so on. That seems awful too. So other countries in Europe have come up with sort of mixed solutions. You can buy insurance up to this amount, but no more without revealing information. And we have mixed solutions in various state legislatures. If you actually take a genetic test, you have to reveal the results. If you don't take a genetic test, the insurance company can't require you to take it. And it's being sorted through on the employment front, too. Then throw in its use for criminal purposes, and it gets even more complex. There you'll have people say, get that information and get those killers, murderers, thieves, rapists off the street. For heaven's sakes, put everybody's DNA in a database, which has been proposed. Right now, Codex has information on a state-by-state basis. It's determined whether they're convicted felons or folks who've been arrested or whatever. DNA goes in there, and increasingly it's being used. Now it's been unified. And so you find some DNA at a crime scene, you plug it into the computer, and you find a suspect who's been previously arrested or convicted like that. So it's these are complex. These would qualify as fractious problems because they implicate human privacy and some of the profound worries about caring for one's family if one gets bad news and so forth. But I would emphasize it sort of, I think, speaks well for my navigational approach because these problems will change. As we develop cures, going to get the genetic test will be like happy time. You go get the genetic test, you'll say, oh, I just need to buy some pills over at the pharmacy and took care of that little issue, now let's go to the park. So eventually the things that are, wrenching and difficult for our policy process will change as science and engineering, or science and technology continue to advance. Hope that was responsive in part. We had back there and then over here, yeah.
And I have two questions. The first one is, what is the definition of child that you're working with? Because it seems like, okay, you're going to order this embryo, and it's going to turn into a child, and it's going to turn into a teenager with a mind of its own, and go to the rebellious stages and stuff like that. And it seems like, if I was a genetic engineer, I'd want to sue my parents for doing this to me because I had no choice in the matter versus when I started growing up. I did get a voice and I did get my own choices. And the second thing is that if RNA changes the genome, what if that baby were a little
Yes, on your first question, I wrote an article that asked just that question. I had an imagined engineered child who grew up. His name was Kevin Clavier, and he was an expert pianist. He was engineered by his parents to be such. He was very successful, and he was miserable because his parents engineered him to be that, and he felt inauthentic, and he felt that his parents could not accept him or who he was meant to be, or who he was in some sense, but had instead to engineer him to be this accomplished pianist. They themselves were wannabe musicians who fell short, and hence all of their ambitions and hopes, just as generations of parents have invested in their kids, usually by piano lessons, but now by genetic engineering, were invested in him. And I think that's a real, genuine, possible psychological phenomenon that I explore. And he tried to make out a lawsuit, and I explore, based on my knowledge of law, all the avenues he might pursue, getting back to the other gentleman's question about liability. And he wasn't successful in my imagining on this article. But if you want the citation, I can send you, if you give me your address, I can send you a copy of the article, and you can see how I explored that very thing. Your second question was about passing on your engineered genome to subsequent generations. So parental choices with respect to this generation are not just engineering this child against, in some sense, that child's will. The child never has a choice in the matter. Of course, children, in the procreative process have little choice about lots of things, like who you choose as a mate and all sorts of things. But nonetheless, they have little choice. But also, of course, the implications of your choice ripple out. One of the things that proponents of genetic engineering view as key to their likely success in proceeding to genetic engineering is finding a technological fix for that worry. And they have, in fact, come up with artificial chromosomes that do not replicate in future generations. You engineer only this child, and then these artificial chromosomes are sort of lost. And so you start fresh in every generation. In the absence of that, of course, folks have been calling this inheritable genetic modification because, of course, as you point out, it would be if you just use, what we're used to, the usual ways of, chromosomes divide and passed along and so on. But I call it genetic engineering because a lot of the folks at the forefront of the science and the promotion of this have thought that that's worrisome. Of course, you could always go in and, unengineer them, but of course, think about tracking down all the descendants and unengineering them, and what would your rationale be, and how do you do that, and so on. So they view that as a really important question they have to address to make this politically viable. Yes, here and then there. I think, yeah.
I am attending this lecture about what I hope to be intellectual curiosity. I know very little about this field. So my question might be predicated on some nutty dystopia or science fiction vision of the issue.
Yeah.
It's a simple question, I apologize. But it seems to me that your discussion has been largely predicated on a society that's still largely based on pluralism, a certain ability to choose, a certain ability of the individual to choose. Where in the debate, or is there a place in the debate where we start talking about possible societies where there would be no choice, not because there is a prohibition, but because there's an obligation?
Yeah.
It's that situation, and it's the whole Logan's Run thing. It's not that you have the right to die at a certain time. You have to die at a certain point. So is there a place for that kind of conversation?
There is. I haven't read or seen Logan's Run, but what you talk about is a dystopia in which policymakers determine what it is people ought to do in terms of genetic engineering of their children, or that sort of thing. You're saying, who's to say that this sort of decision interface I'm exploring, which is should we prohibit it or permit it, promote it, regulate it, restrict it, and so forth, where I keep finding myself personally not eager to engage in this practice or encourage it in others, but sort of pulled by a commitment to pluralism and choice that, makes me often fall on this side and say, well, if others want to do it, they ought to do it. But you're saying, what about a scenario in which people say, look what the Russians are doing. Look what the Chinese are doing. Look at where our economy is headed. And look at what these genetic engineers can do now. We need a national pull ourselves up by the socks policy. And just like we, landed a man on the moon when they put Sputnik up, and just like we, responded in kind when folks are doing whatever they're doing in Southeast Asia, now what we got to do is, take stock of our genetic endowment here in the US of A and make sure it's up to snuff and competitive. I sort of hinted at that when I talked about, engineering for smart kids, for their own welfare and for the sort of competitiveness of the USA. Now, can I imagine that policy? I mean, Michael, my colleague, Professor Hoffman, mentioned my optimism. In my optimism, and based on our historical experience, and there Dr. Lombardo also can opine, we've experienced the horror of coercive eugenics in the past, and this would map on. I mean, can humans do this? Yes, they can. Can they do it to an extent that you wouldn't believe possible until you read the records, as Dr. Lombardo does in detail, and you see it all played out, individual by individual, choice by choice. They can do it. Will they do it again? That's sort of, have we learned the lesson? Have we learned the lesson for good? Have we learned the right lesson? What is the carry-away lesson? Is it sort of captured permanently in our jurisprudence or our cultural ethic? Nothing is permanent. Everything is always revisable. A change is constant. There's always a risk. But my view looking out for the next few generations is that the commitments we have now to a range of choice are so embedded, and we have such strange bedfellows in a way. It's folks who want free choice with abortion, and it's folks who want free choice with genetic engineering, and there's all these sort of overlapping constituencies that for whom having a realm of free choice is what they have in common, even though their choices and commitments are different, that it's hard to imagine. On the other hand, we've seen things can change in an instant when bombs fall or, missiles fly. Things change, and everything you thought was so one day is very different the next day. We're not so used to that in the U.S., but people around the world experience that, with shocking regularity. So could it happen? It could happen. Optimistically, in the U.S. of A., I don't think it's going to happen, but I don't know. Yes?
Do you have a definition of child abuse? That is, at what point the government should intervene to prevent that kind of activity?
I don't, but you're right to see that that's crucial, because in much of the discussion when we talk about, sort of this navigational approach, when we look at past examples and future imaginings, a lot of what we're doing is looking back at previous sort of navigation. When I talked about our accumulated knowledge that's memorialized in principles and in laws and in policies and in sort of cultural norms, we have a sense, each of us, I think, if I were to list 83 horrific things on the board, you would, I think, all agree on 58 of them as constituting child abuse, disagree on maybe 6 of them as maybe in the realm of parental choice, even though kind of yucky, and, probably agree that the others were not. And so what is that a product of? I mean, if I ran the same exercise 50 years ago, I think it would be different. A lot more people would say, spank the heck out of them, teach them something. So, but, I think we do. But is that, in the same sense as this gentleman is asking about, is there any sort of fixed standard? Is there any guarantee that that won't change? Is there anything sort of that captures all dimensions of what we might mean by child abuse? No, we're constantly defining and redefining it. And, some of the sort of worst examples of child abuse are probably captured in a glance and a smirk and that sort of thing, which we can never capture in our laws and never have a hard enough time trying to describe it or express it, and people who are subject to it have a hard time for that reason in coming to terms with it. So we have no sort of fixed definition of child abuse, either, by a listing or by some sort of definition that captures these elements of it or something. Instead, we're constantly struggling. So it's sort of a bootstrapping operation. We're constantly, that definition is in flux. Meanwhile, we're trying to compare current prospective genetic engineering exercises with a definition in flux, and we keep sort of, going back and forth and saying, well, this feels more like child abuse. Why? In what ways is it similar? In what ways is it different? But, we are guided, I think, by principles, be they, founded ultimately in human dignity or whatever, about, the liberty and the welfare of the child, which do at least constrain our choices somewhat. So, difficult exercise, no certainty, no fixed points, but one I think we can engage in. And I think we do, I think social welfare agencies engage in it all the time when they go and deal with situations in households and have to make tough calls. So this, in a different context, we would have to struggle with difficult cases at the margin. Was that responsive?
Yes, sound like a no. Right.
Yeah. No, we don't. We don't have a fixed definition. No, I don't have I certainly not.
You've identified a lot of the issues and given a lot of careful thought to them and come up with processes for getting at them and so on.
Yeah.
But you might have actually come up with your own set of criteria.
No, yeah, I don't think we can. I think it's a social navigation to what it means, and then it's constantly changing. And so there is no, I offer none. I could offer my own views and would in a social conversation. Well, that would be, a 2-hour conversation. I go into those winks and nods and smirks. My book, I should say yes, and it's available on Amazon. But I don't know that my book refers to the same sort of, navigational approach, obviously, and refers to child abuse and child neglect and so forth. I guess it explores it in more context where you might get a sense of where I think those lines are drawn. But whether it's worth the price they charge, I can't tell you. It's hardback.
I think we should end on that wonderful advertising series.
I'll hold it up, too.
Show it up.
I have it. I actually, it sort of looks like my PowerPoint.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.